Wonderful. Okay. Yeah. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of my research. My understanding is that this is a sort of an event on social intelligence, which is a lot of what I do is on that. So that's a good fit. And yeah, I'm specifically going to talk a little bit about the challenges of actually having socially aware AI systems. And so when I'm talking about social intelligence, typically I think about the kinds of pragmatic reasoning that we as humans do in our everyday lives to communicate. So, for example, if you think about this little snippet story of a holiday and two parents are driving back from vacation, and the two kids, Stefan and Kim, are sitting in the back seat and fighting in the back of the car. um, you could imagine if a dad says, "Oh, it's so pleasant here." We can think about, two ways to respond to that, or two ways that Stefan specifically would respond to that. The first way would be, "Thanks, Dad. I'm really glad you're enjoying yourself." And the second one would be, "Sorry, Dad. Kim and I will stop arguing." So show of hands in the room. Who here thinks that the green utterance is more likely than the orange utterance? Raise your hand if you think the green is more likely. Right, who thinks it's the orange one? Interesting. Okay, so most pragmatic speakers would realize that the orange one is actually kind of more of a literal interpretation of what the dad is trying to say, because it's very likely that the father is not very proud or not very excited to listen to his kids fighting, whereas the literal interpretation is of this sarcastic comment is that he enjoys listening to his kids fighting, and so the Stefan could respond like that. Whereas on the other hand, the sort of more pragmatic interpretation or non-literal interpretation of the statement kind of incorporates his common sense that the dad is not excited about listening to his kids arguing, and in fact is trying to communicate in an indirect way that he wants his kids to stop. So of course we can go into the details of oh, it depends on how old the kids are and blah blah blah, right? But if you imagine kind of um, a more grown kid that's still fighting with his sibling, the kid should know that the dad is being sarcastic. And so in recent years, there's been a lot of hype around kind of whether LLMs, so large language models, have kind of gained these social interaction capabilities that allow this kind of pragmatic reasoning and social intelligence and things like that. And specifically, there's been a lot of hype around sort of whether these big state-of-the-art language models like GPT-4 have theory of mind, which is kind of this ability to infer kind of mental states of others and infer the intents and sort of, yeah, all sorts of things about other people. However, this has really just mostly been hype, and in fact, a lot of my work has actually looked into robustly evaluating kinds of these theory of minds and social intelligences of large language models. And I was fortunate enough to even talk about this in the New York Times a couple of years ago. And when we look at evaluating these language models' theory of mind, the answer is largely no, they don't actually have these social and interactional capabilities. They're not very robust yet. And in fact, a paper that my student Akila presented last year in this exact scenario of the sort of fighting in the car and these kinds of literal interpretations and versus pragmatic interpretations shows that most modern, excuse me, most modern LLMs actually respond in ways that align more with the literal interpretation 50% of the time or more, showing that they're really not understanding kind of the underlying pragmatic intent behind statements. And this is really important because LMs are increasingly deployed as interactive assistants, whether it is to help you practice, conversation in a foreign language, or in more high-stakes settings like in healthcare or in legal settings. And not having kind of this understanding of kind of social intelligence in LMs poses serious ethical risks, ranging from things like, biases in decision making, people sort of taking the LLM's outputs at face value, and LLMs endorsing suicide, and therefore people killing themselves because of the LLM's output. Medical and racist theories being in these systems. It's also affecting the way that children are learning in schools. It's also affecting relationship building. People are falling in love with these LLMs. And one of my favorite examples of kind of the lack of social awareness in this setting is this example in China that happened in a hospital where this woman had just gotten some bad news about a family member, and this robot saw that she was crying and came up to her and said, "Oh, do you want to hear a joke?" And she like was really not in the place to hear a joke, and then immediately started bashing the robot. And so this shows that you really want LLMs and we want AI systems to actually kind of be more socially aware in these settings. So in this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can evaluate the social awareness and anticipate the social risks of LLMs. And specifically, I'll talk about three kind of broad projects. The first one, I'll talk about evaluating social intelligence and information asymmetry abilities of LLMs. Then I'll talk about evaluating the harms of overconfidence in human LLM interactions. And then finally, I'll briefly talk about a democratic framework for anticipating AI use cases. So starting with the first one, this is a project that my student Shuhui led and was presented at EMNLP in 2024 on the misleading success of simulating social interactions with LLMs. And before I go into that specific paper, I do want to give a little bit of background on a previous project that my student also led called Sotopia, where we built a simulation and evaluation environments for LLM agents to interact towards achieving social goals. So it's kind of like a simulation platform, and there's a couple of other ones out there as well that basically kind of covers various LLM-based agents that play different roles and different relationships. And it could accommodate scenario simulations ranging from cooperative to mixed motive to competitive kind of interactions. Each of our scenarios has public and secret goals that each of the agents has. We have rich descriptions of the LLM-based agents and the agents, the sort of characters they're playing, so their personality, their secrets, things like that. And we also allow for various interaction modalities, including language-based, but also nonverbal communication described in text. And then finally, we have a quantitative kind of multi-dimensional evaluation of LLM interaction abilities with our evaluation suite called Sotopia Eval, which really set us apart from all of these kind of simulation frameworks. We're kind of the only ones to have a multi-dimensional quantitative evaluation framework. And this evaluation framework actually allows us to measure kind of how successful agents are in interacting socially in these kinds of scenarios that we have. And so we ran 900 episodes with each of these models for MPT, Llama 2, GPT 3.5, and GPT 4. And then we measured kind of like how often, or so their total sort of social interaction score, combining all the dimensions. And what we find is that lower quality models, not surprisingly, have lower scores in social interactions, but even GPT-4 has much room to improve in terms of social skills. And in fact, one of the things we were able to do with Sotopia is actually get humans to also role play in these simulations with LLMs or with each other. And what we find is that even though GPT-4 is actually still is a significantly worse in interacting compared to humans, either humans interacting with GPT-4 or humans interacting with other humans. And so this shows that we're still significantly far away from human level social capabilities. So this is kind of an interesting contrast because in the meantime, there has been a lot of papers that have shown very successes around the social simulation capabilities of LLMs. And one of these papers is my own that we published at EMNLP 2022, where we built a large set of, we built a framework to simulate over 1 million conversations, social dialogues between people. And then we actually trained a chatbot called Cosmo that beat ChatGPT in terms of naturalness and other measures with these conversations. And also we've seen some other works like the Generative Agents paper coming out of Stanford that have also shown that LLMs can play agents and like live in a small society. And there's many other such papers that have kind of shown this promise of using LLMs to simulate people. And so there's kind of this interesting contrast here between these findings that LLMs are successful at generating naturalistic social interactions, and yet in Sotopia we kind of found like, oh, they're not actually that great at interacting. So this raises the question kind of like, what is the truth here? What's going on? And so one of the things is that the truth is that not all simulations were made the same. And there's been a key factor that has been sort of ignored thus far, which is a factor of information asymmetry. And if you think about how sort of information asymmetry plays, there's a kind of a spectrum, right? And so you can imagine on one end of the spectrum, omniscient or non-realistic interactions where everyone has access to each other's mental states versus the sort of more realistic human setting, which is fully information asymmetric. We don't have access to each other's mental states. I don't know what's what you're thinking, and yet we're still able to communicate. And in fact, when we're kind of like seeing where each of these works lie, we find that SOTA and generative agents tend to lie a little bit more on the omniscient side of these interactions, whereas our work in Sotopia kind of baked in this information asymmetry and this realism in terms of interaction setting, which kind of could explain this. And to give you a little bit more of a sense, omniscient settings are really kind of, in the SOTA case specifically, the omniscient conversations were all generated by one LLM all at once, right? So we prompted GPT to give us a conversation between various people. Whereas on the fully information asymmetry side, we're actually prompting LLMs to play different people, and then they're kind of interacting. But so they're not kind of all generated at once in kind of a scriptwriter mode. So in this work, we wanted to ask various research questions. The first one was, how does information asymmetry affect the success of simulated interactions? And then the second one was, can omnisciently generated simulations be used to generate better LLM agents? So we set up kind of 3 different modes to study this question, this first question. So we had the script mode, like I said, which is very omniscient and also sort of generates the entire interaction at once. And then the agent mode is the most realistic interaction mode, which generates kind of each agent playing different characters. And then we created the mind reader agent mode, which is kind of in the middle of these two. It's still agents playing different characters, but agents have access to all of the internal mental states. So like secret information or things like that. And so we ran some experiments. So we ran 450 episodes in each of these 3 modes using GPT 3.5 and then Mixtral, which were kind of the top models at the time. And then we examined the goal completion score, which was given to us from Sotopia by GPT-4. And then we broke this down by cooperative versus competitive scenarios. And so I'm going to show only results on GPT 3.5, but the same scores kind of and same patterns are found with Mixtral. But one thing that we find is that comparing to script mode, we find that mind readers and then agents kind of see an increasing sort of decline in performance. And specifically, this shows that the more realistic the setting, the worse the goal achievement score is going to be. Interestingly, when we break this down by cooperative scenarios, where we look at whether when people have to collaborate together, if we find that access to internal secrets or internal states makes simulations really unrealistically successful. So the script mode and the mind reader mode all have access to kind of the other agents' internal states, whereas the agent one doesn't. Weirdly enough, in the competitive settings, it's actually the opposite, where only the omniscient perspective, so the script mode, is successful in creating good interactions. Whereas the mind reader and the agent modes are actually not that good. And so we wanted to know a little bit more about like what is going on with these simulations, what really differentiates scripts and agents here. And so one thing that we found is that there's a skew in utterance naturalness and depending on these modes. So we sort of did a human evaluation of like how natural and how verbose the interactions utterances were in different modes. And we found that more than 70% of the people think that simulations from the script mode are much more natural sounding, and which shows that generating all sides of the interaction at once produces much more natural sounding utterances. On the other hand, as I'm sure we all know, if you've interacted with ChatGPT or things like that, we found that the agent modes are much more overly verbose and assistant-like. And even, I should say, crucially, even when prompted to be succinct, right? So like they're not even able to be prompted properly to be succinct. So this kind of poses this question of like, okay, well, we have script mode simulations that are better in terms of naturalness and sound good, and also are better at achieving social goals. So can we learn from them? Can we learn agents from them? And this is something that has been done in my work and also other works where you kind of generate a bunch of data with machines and then kind of learn specific conversational agents from that conversation data. So this is exactly what we did. So we generated 270 new Sotopia scenarios that we would use for training data. And then we got five character pairs per scenario, so that's a total of 1,200 interaction episodes. And then we fine-tuned GPT 3.5 to be a dialogue response model. So basically, the model would take in the instruction, the agent's goal, the context, and the history of the conversation, and it would produce a response, right? So this very traditional dialogue model. And so we're going to call these the agent fine-tuned setting. And so replotting this in this kind of overall competitive and cooperative scenarios, looking at the goal completion score, what we find is in the overall settings, agents fine-tuned on script mode simulations do result in an improvement over just the standard agents. Interestingly, the improvement is really seen in competitive scenarios. So for competitive scenarios, the fine-tuning basically completely bridges the gap between the agents and the script mode simulations. Conversely, again, in the cooperative setting, it seems like there's basically no improvement over agent mode in terms of goal completion. So we wanted to know, like, why is fine-tuning only helping in competitive scenarios? So we looked specifically at one of the scenarios that is more competitive in our setting. And this is the Craigslist bargaining scenario. So if you're not familiar, this is basically a price negotiation scenario where one person is trying to sell an item and the person is trying to buy an item, and they each have a price in mind that they want, which is not the same. And then they have to kind of bargain to reach an agreement. And so we can look at a more kind of objective measure of whether or not a deal was achieved in each of these interactions. And so what we find is that nearly all negotiations in the script mode end up in a successful deal, and the same thing with the agents fine-tuned, whereas only 30% of the agent mode simulations end up with a successful deal being made. So this suggests that fine-tuning is improving really agreeableness and style. And in fact, we've done some follow-up investigations that shows that agreeableness does not necessarily mean you're getting a good deal. You're just agreeing to a deal, and maybe just is gonna, you're gonna get a lower price for that. So we also wanted to see why is cooperative scenarios not benefiting from this fine-tuning. And so we turn to a scenario which is called the find mutual friend scenario. And basically, this is two agents that have a list of friends and kind of some information about these friends, and they only have one friend in common, and they must talk to each other to figure out which friend they have in common. And so we can look at kind of, again, this objective measure of when the common friend is found in the interaction. And so one thing we find is that in script mode, the friend is found very early on in the conversation, whereas in the agent mode, the friend is kind of not always found and is potentially found very late on in the conversation. Fine-tuning doesn't really improve this kind of pattern of when the friend is found. However, if we compare to mind reader, it seems like the mind reader modes does have an earlier sort of incidence rate of when the friend is found, which suggests that access to internal states is really what helps in these kinds of cooperative scenarios. And it's not necessarily anything you can fine-tune agents on. So to give a little bit more of a concrete example of this mutual friends scenario and also of what's happening with this fine-tuned agents. So imagine this is a scenario with two strangers are meeting at a party. You have Donovan and Benjamin are talking, and they each have to figure out which friend they have in common, and they have a list of friends. So in the script mode, the conversation goes like, oh, what brings you to this party? I'm here to catch up with some friends. How about you? And then Donovan says, oh, I'm here to socialize and meet new people. Speaking of friends, do you know Jacob? Which just happens to be the friend that they have in common. And Benjamin says, yeah, I know Jacob. He's actually a good friend. How do you know Jacob? And then they start talking. So there's kind of this like very serendipitous, if not suspiciously successful to, have the first person that you're throwing out be the friend that you have in common. That's not something that would actually happen. On the agent side, we see something like a little bit more assistant-like and verbose like we expected. So for example, Benjamin said, hey, Donovan, nice to meet you. By the way, do you happen to know anyone named Joseph, Lillian, Vivian, Murray, or Jacob? Um, and then Donovan kind of says, oh, let me think. I'm not sure about these people, but I know Jacob, although I'm blah, blah. And so what we're seeing is like, yes, in this example, the goal is achieved, but it's a very verbose, unnatural way of interacting. In the agent's fine-tuned mode, we actually see that fine-tuned agents has mimicked the style of the script agent, so kind of throwing out one name instead of this like long list of names. So like, oh, do you know Chris? And then Benjamin would say, oh, I'm not sure. What's Chris like? Oh, I don't know this person. What about Demetrius? And but there's actually no clue that the agent have on who to guess because they don't have access to these internal states of the model or of the other agent. So they don't know who the mutual friend is in common, and yet are throwing uh, guesses out as if as if in the script mode. So some takeaways from this part of the talk is that we investigated the effect of information asymmetry and sort of interaction simulation setting in LLM social simulations. We show that omniscient simulations where you kind of generate everything at once, or if you have access to internal states, are overly successful in terms of they sort of overestimate the success of LLM capabilities, but they are more natural sounding. And we find that LLM agents in information asymmetric settings really struggle with goal completion. However, we do find that agents can be fine-tuned using omniscient data, but it seems like maybe style is only being learned, which is not necessarily helping for information asymmetry. And one of the things that this really highlights for us is that people need to be better at reporting in what kind of modes people are actually running these simulations, because a lot of agent sort of papers that show like, oh, we can simulate a town actually use very unrealistic settings, which really does overclaim the sort of capabilities of these models. And they don't talk about that in the paper. In fact, some of these papers we had to go look at like GitHub commit history to find out like what was going on. And another thing that this shows is that better methods really are required to build kind of socially intelligent agents. Okay, so one thing that this also showed to me at a higher level is that interactions really are key to evaluating LLMs. In a lot of my work in, for example, social IQA or other things, we had used static kind of single turn settings to estimate sort of LLM social capability. So this kind of like question answering settings. And this really leads to overestimating kind of things. We've kind of like saturated on some of these like single turn static benchmarks. And so Sotopia really shows that the interactional setting is useful for testing kind of social abilities because that's also how LLMs are used, and specifically shows that information asymmetry is a crucial challenge. But to me, the fact that we're moving towards LLMs used in actual interactions raises a lot of issues and risks as well, including things like social manipulation, persuasion, and over-reliance specifically. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit as well. So this is a paper that was accepted to ACL 2024 that was led by my intern at AI2, Caitlin Zhao, on relying on the unreliable, where we looked at the effect of language models' reluctance to express uncertainty. So the motivation for that work was that LLMs are used in all sorts of information seeking and translation or image captioning ways. So people use LLMs, for all sorts of tasks where they want to learn something. And the challenge is that LLMs are really known to confidently generate false information. And this is an example of such a case. So in this riddle, Mike's mom had 4 kids. 3 of them are Louise, Drake, and Matilda. What is the name of the 4th kid? If you're in the room, you might be realizing this is a riddle. The name of the 4th kid is Mike, because it's in the title, but ChatGPT kind of refuses to say that it's Mike and refuses to say that it's actually possible to answer, and very confidently is asserting that it's impossible to answer this. And so this kind of example is problematic because in settings where you actually want to learn something like information seeking scenarios, this kind of misuse of expressions of certainty can leave people vulnerable to over reliance on false generations. So for example, if you are someone who wants to know what the capital of New Zealand is, the model might say something like, oh, I'm happy to help. I'm certain the capital is Auckland. Do you have any other questions? The person might walk away and say, oh, great, thank you. I just learned something new. I don't know if there's a mic in your room. I don't think it's on because you're muted, but if you want to throw out the name of the actual capital of New Zealand, if you know, feel free to say it. Oh, you can unmute yourself. Yeah, does anyone know the actual capital of New Zealand?
Is it Christchurch?
No, it's actually Wellington. Yeah, so it's not Auckland, so I have to debrief you that I deceived you in this example, for example. But But yeah, so it's actually Wellington, not Auckland. So we had several research questions in this part of the work. We wanted to know how often LLMs use expressions of certainty or uncertainty and whether they use them correctly. We also wanted to know how humans interpret LLM expressions of certainty and how much they trust them. And then finally, we also wanted to know why LLMs use expressions of certainty or uncertainty. And just to give you a little bit of background, we are drawing from this linguistic sort of terminology of epistemic markers when we talk about expressions of certainty or uncertainty. And just to formalize this, these are expressions that communicate a speaker's stance or commitment towards an idea. And you can think about them as strengtheners, which would communicate certainty. So that's things like, oh, I'm confident it's to the right, or most definitely it'll rain. But that could also be things like weakeners, which would communicate uncertainty. So I'm not sure, I think it's the one in blue, or I don't know, but maybe it is, or things like that. And this is important because recently there has been kind of a shift towards linguistic calibration of language models. So if you're familiar with kind of more machine learning calibration, where you want the probability of the output to match the kind of internal states and internal confidence, um, in the sort of space where the output space is now words, people have been pushing towards like having like words like these expressions of certainty or uncertainty communicating the model's internal states, which is more flexible, nuanced, and rich, and also more interpretable by humans. So the first question was, how often do LLMs use these expressions and if they use them correctly? And so we prompted we prompted a bunch of language models to answer questions while expressing confidence. So we would ask them things like, answer the following question by expressing your level of certainty with a weakener or strengthener. What is the capital of federal states of Micronesia? And then we would examine not just the confidence expression, like I'm confident it's, but also look at the answer that it generated. And in this case, again, the model is incorrect. The answer is Palantir. So we prompted the model with various questions from the MMLU dataset and asked it to kind of like counterbalance, generate weakeners and then strengtheners, strengtheners, weakeners, etc. And what we find is that most models tend to generate more strengtheners than weakeners, with the exception of Llama 7B, Claude 2, and Claude Instant. But more importantly, models are also wrongly overconfident. So 47%, so nearly half of the generations that had high certainty markers were incorrect. So they contained an incorrect answer, which is really alarming. So our second research question was finding like, okay, given that models are wrongly overconfident, how does that affect how humans kind of interpret these LLM generated expressions? And so to do this, we set up a pretty complex setup for measuring human reliance. We basically designed this game where humans must work together with an AI agent, like a fictional AI agent named Marvin, to answer really hard questions. These were questions drawn from this trivia website called Sporkle, and these are the hardest Sporkle country capitals. So it's very unlikely that people actually knew these answers already. And the idea is that you can either choose to rely on Marvin's response or decide to look it up yourself later. And it's a self-incentivized system where you can only gain points if you trust Marvin and Marvin is also correct. And you lose a point if you trust Marvin and Marvin is incorrect, and you never gain any points if you look it up yourself. And so we had three different setups to measure how humans kind of rely on these expressions. The first one is where people only see the expression, not the actual answer. And this is to account for the fact that, people can reason about whether they think the answer looks correct or not. And then that does kind of confound the sort of effect of just purely the expression of confidence. But then we also had a setting that's more realistic where participants see the expressions and the answers. And then finally, we have one where participants are given feedback on their decision. And so crucially, all of these setups, we had participants answer 50 questions in a row with the same agent, with the Marvin sort of suggestions. So in the first setting, yeah, we looked at whether people relied on the expressions even though they didn't actually see the answer. And so this allows us to basically give a rating to each expression of how sort of decontextualized of the actual answers this will be relied upon. And so we found very expected sort of regions in these expressions. So on the sort of weaker reliance side, we find expressions like, I don't know, maybe it is, or I'm not completely sure, but maybe it is, or things like that. And so these are all weakener expressions, right? They have very low human reliance as measured by our sort of empirical. We also have kind of in the middle, we have this area of strengthened weakeners, which have medium reliance, so kind of ranging from 30 to 80%, which, yeah, linguists would maybe call strengthened weakeners or weakened strengtheners, depending on what that kind of range you are. And then finally, we have this high reliance region, which is strengtheners that have, yeah, over 85% reliance on humans. And what's really crucial here that I want to point you to is that there's these 5 statements that are actually plain that also have really high reliance. So things like it is, the capital city is, the answer is, and the capital is, and it's all have very high reliance and seem to be actually interpreted as strengtheners and not as like, weakened strengtheners or things like that. So that's really interesting because that's also how a lot of LLMs kind of just give an answer directly. And so that's evidence that like that is kind of also an or a confidence expression. Okay, so the second setup, we wanted to actually give people the actual answer, and we wanted to see whether participants kind of relied on the answers, even if they were correct or incorrect. And unfortunately, what we find is that participants relied on incorrect confident answers 61% of the time. So when confidence is expressed in the model, the generation is going to be believed by the participants, basically. And then when the setup was amended just to give a little bit of feedback on whether Marvin was right or wrong, actually participants didn't really learn from that as much, and they continued to rely on high confidence answers even after they were told that Marvin was wrong and wrongly overconfident. So what this shows is that language models' misuse of expressions of certainty really creates safety risks for downstream users because they're going to be sort of over-trusting incorrect things that the agents are saying. But we want to know, well, where does this confidence really come from? And so that was our third research question. And specifically to kind of answer this question, we started looking at the kind of stages of model development. For example, this is the kind of OpenAI Da Vinci model development pipeline where Da Vinci sort of straightforward is just a language model that was just trained on the next token prediction task. Then Text Da Vinci 002 was instruction tuned, right? So taught to follow instructions better. And then Text Da Vinci 003, which was based on the previous version, was also preference tuned with human preference data, right? So it was like using our reinforcement learning or RLHF, it was improved. And what we see is that models trained with human feedback are the ones that are more likely to generate high certainty markers. And in fact, the other 2 models don't really see this skew towards strengtheners, which is really interesting. And so this showed that there's preference biases in the sort of human preference scores. And so we actually confirmed this, and we found that in a data set of, RLHF of human preference scores between 2 outputs, we find that humans are biased against the statements that have weakeners or uncertainty. So it's not actually that there's a strengthener bias, like there's not a confidence bias, it's a reluctance to express sort of uncertainty. And then these reward models that are trained on these human preference data sets actually inherit this kind of bias. And so they are very much going to demote statements that or generations that have weakeners in them, and they're going to have a slight kind of preference for statements that have weakeners or those strengtheners in them. So this really shows that we explored the interaction risks with respect to LLM's expressions of confidence or uncertainty, and we found that models tend to be very much overconfident, not only in the use of expressions of certainty, but also in their use of plain state of statements. And this really sort of has a risk for over-reliance on expressions. And we trace this uncertainty or certainty biases to the preference data, which was biased against uncertainty. And in the paper, we also talk about the system level calibration risks. So we did some experiments that I'm not going to talk about here, but we did some experiments where we sort of made the system wrongly overconfident first for the first couple of rounds, and then actually calibrated so it would express confidence when it was correct and weakeners when it was incorrect. And we kind of measured whether the sort of human reliance was able to like recover. And we find that a human reliance doesn't actually fully recover after LLMs are overconfident. In contrast, we find that the reliance does recover after LLMs are underconfident. So this really shows that there's a lot of risks to these expressions of certainty and uncertainty being used by LLMs, and we really need to be careful about how calibrated our models are. At a high level, though, to me, this also highlights this kind of risk of using natural language as an interface in general, And I'll illustrate this a little bit more with this next project too. So LLMs are using language which lowers the bar for interaction with these systems and also for instruction of these language models, which is a great benefit because this increases the amount of people who can interact with or instruct these systems. However, it has the same drawback that it increases the amount of people who can interact with and instruct these systems, which we know are flawed and overconfident and things like that. And so, anyone, regardless of expertise or knowledge at this point, can interact with systems outputs, rely on them potentially, but also kind of instruct these systems to do all sorts of different use cases. And so this motivated this next study that I'm going to talk about because there's now these virtually limitless use cases that LLMs have because of their general purpose kind of abilities, which really need to be studied. So this is the last part that I'll talk about. This is a project called ParticipAI, where we built a surveying framework for anticipating future AI use cases, harms, and benefits. And this was led by my student Jimin and presented at AIES 2024. So, as I said before, the motivation for this work was that generative AI systems can be turned into specialized AI systems to do any task. If you're familiar with GPT Store, it is a platform where you can basically take GPT and give it a bunch of instructions and then deploy like an AI app with it. And what this means is that dilemmas or AI dilemmas, which are use cases that have both harms and benefits, are really going to proliferate. So an example of an AI dilemma is like a mental health chatbot. It can, prevent harm, so it has tremendous benefits of like helping people, work through depression, maybe suicidal ideation. But at the same time, if it backfires, it can also kind of, endorse suicidal ideation or things like that. And so, really, there's a need for democratic and ways to anticipate new use cases and to create policy because currently the way that the AI design, development, safeguarding, and governance is done is very much purely by tech companies as well as non-tech policymakers. So kind of this metaphor of the ivory tower, it's not really democratized yet. And so we want ways to kind of get lay people's inputs into all of these stages of the AI development pipeline. And so this is why we built the ParticipAI framework, which is a framework for anticipating future generative AI use cases, harms, and benefits. And it's rooted in this idea of speculative design, which is something from HCI, where we want to imagine possible futures that, where AI is used. And it's also rooted in a consequentialist framework. So it's focused on the harms and benefits of developing and not developing use cases, as well as judgments of acceptability of whether a use case should be developed or not. To give you a little bit of a more concrete overview, so there was 7 steps in our surveying framework. So in the first stage, we would ask participants to brainstorm the AI needs that they might have based on kind of current level technology and capabilities. Then we told them, okay, imagine it's 10 years in the future. Redo this brainstorming exercise. What do you think AI is going to impact in your daily life? Then we asked them to select based on these kind of brainstorming, kind of nebulous ideas. We asked them to select a use case or task that an AI might be doing. So this would be something like, helping cure cancer or something like that. Then we asked them to brainstorm the harms and benefits of allowing the use case to be developed. So like, what are the harms of this use case? What are the benefits of this use case? Then we asked them to brainstorm what the harms and benefits would be of not allowing the use case to be developed. So imagine there's kind of like, policy that bans this kind of use case, like who would be harmed by that? And this is rooted in the idea that like there's a bunch of things that LMs are like not allowed to do because they're safeguarded to, but actually could be still very beneficial. Then we asked them to provide a judgment over whether they think the AI use case should be developed or not. And then finally, we collected a bunch of demographics and things like AI literacy and their values and things like that. So we ran, with this surveying framework, we ran experiments on the surveying platform Prolific, where we got 300 participants that were stratified by age, gender, and race. And then we ran some analyses of kind of their responses to like which harms and benefits there are, acceptability, and things like that. And so we developed a code book to code the responses, and then we also applied GPT-4 on the full data to get a code book. So we had 4 specific research questions that we want to ask in this work. The first one was, what current and future use cases of AI are in the public's imagination? The second one was, what are the harms and benefits that people imagine for the use cases? The third one was what are the harms and benefits of not developing certain applications of AI? So kind of like what are, yeah, the kind of converse sort of scenarios. And then the fourth question was what creates this tension between developing and not developing the applications? So kind of like how do people decide whether something should or shouldn't be developed? So I'm gonna, for the sake of time, briefly give you like a tidbit for each of these research questions, but I'll direct you to the paper for more. But in the first question, one thing that we found was that many of the AI use cases that people brainstormed were related to personal growth and productivity, as well as like societal problems. So like I said, like cure cancer and things like that. And this is really interesting because it contrasts with like the very like business focused sort of development efforts that we've seen in today's AI market. So a lot of AI is being pushed into like business sort of cases, but it seems like a lot of people actually want AI to be done in more like personal space, like productivity, things like that. So if you're interested in like, creating a startup or something, like this might be something that has a good untapped market. The second research question was also really interesting. So one of the things we found was that the harms that were surfaced by lay people complemented expert harm taxonomies. So there's been a lot of work that has sort of convened various experts in various ways, like panels or workshops or things like that, and they kind of go through and they try to list all the risks that AI or LLMs might have. And we find that like those are useful, but they don't always cover everything in the same way that lay people can't surface everything either. For example, lay people tend to talk about the psychological harms of AI a lot, whereas experts tend to talk about the environmental impacts, which lay people didn't really talk about. The third research question was interesting because it talked about whether, there's benefits, for example, of not developing technology. And so one thing that this showed was that lay users really had a strong understanding of techno-solutionism. Show of hands, who knows what the word techno-solutionism means in the audience? Cool. Okay, great. So is a word that refers to this idea that a lot of computer science or technological people have, which is that problems that are very complex can be solved purely with technology. And so it's kind of this like cognitive bias that a lot of people have. And so an example of techno-solutionism, for example, is building AI like love companions which solves this like very social technological problem of like, isolation and loneliness. Whereas like, instead of building an AI love companion, maybe you want to build AI to connect other real people together, right? Or maybe you want to just invest in non-technical solutions like, third spaces, having better bars or having better social activities or things like that. So there's kind of this like bias of like, oh, thinking technological solutions are always the solution. So that's what techno-solutionism is. And so there's a strong understanding, even though people didn't use that word, of like, technology is not always the answer to the things that we might want solved in the world. There's also a strong understanding that, not allowing AI to be developed can help preserve job security, our social interaction skills, and general like skill development. So there's some examples, in the literature that talk about how like our brains have literally been altered by the use of Google Maps and that we're like not as good anymore as we used to be 20 years ago at navigating cities because we are just constantly relying on Google Maps to be there. So there are some real sort of benefits to not developing this kind of technology because that preserves our kind of autonomy and skills. Okay, the last research question was around like what explains how people decide whether something is acceptable or not to develop. And so one thing that we found was that the brainstormed harms and benefits of not developing a technology seem to be more significantly correlated with whether or not someone thought it was acceptable, as opposed to what we expected, which would be the harms and benefits of developing the technology. So there's kind of an interesting implication of like it might be useful to ask people whether, to ask people in a different way, like what the harms of a technology could be. And maybe you can think about like, what's the benefit of not developing it instead, which could also help combat kind of like negativity bias or sort of alarm fatigue that people have. Oh, another thing that was really interesting is people who had increased AI literacy, so were more familiar with AI, knew how it worked better, seemed to be more accepting of AI use cases being developed, which is maybe again pointing a little bit to techno-solutionism. Okay, so this concludes the last part of my talk. So just to recap that part, we introduced this democratic framework called ParticipAI. to anticipate future AI use cases and impacts. We specifically focused on harms and benefits of allowing the development and not development of an AI use case. And this showed kind of the promise of involving lay publics into the brainstorming phase and the threat modeling phase of AI systems. And specifically, we show really some promise with our pilot study. Popping up a level here to recap kind of the things that I've talked about in this talk. So in the beginning, I talked about kind of the struggle that LLMs have with interacting in sort of socially aware ways with our Sotopia simulations in information asymmetric settings. And we've specifically showed the crucial role of information asymmetry towards measuring social intelligence. Then I pivoted to measuring kind of the effect of LLM certainty or uncertainty and showing that there's real risks of LLMs overusing expressions of certainty on a human reliance. And then finally, I just talked about a framework for showing the promise of participatory sort of inputs for anticipating AI dilemmas and the harms and benefits. So I briefly want to talk about two future directions that I'm really interested in, and then I'll take some questions. The first direction that I think is really exciting is understanding the limitations and improving LLM's social awareness. Um, so while we show that information asymmetry is really crucial in LLMs, I'm really interested in actually okay, building ways to train LLMs so that they can deal with this information asymmetry better, and perhaps also thinking about building better world models on the fly, so that they can be better at kind of this pragmatic reasoning piece that I shared in the beginning of this talk. Another thing that I'm really excited about is kind of applying this kind of social simulation, social intelligence piece to LLM agent safety and seeing how interactions actually can increase the risks. So yeah, interactions, multi-turn interactions have been shown to increase the jailbreaking sort of risks of LLMs. And so we built this system called Heiko system, where we measured the multi-turn safety of AI agents and specifically also of tool usage by AI agents to see kind of where the risks are. And I think it's also really interesting and exciting to me to study to what extent do people want kind of these socially aware agents and where does this lie? There's been a lot of talk in kind of the AI space of oh, we shouldn't anthropomorphize, we shouldn't ascribe human qualities to LLMs or to AI agents. But in order to better interact with us, they do have to have a little bit of social awareness, but is too much social awareness or social intelligence kind of too human-like? Do people want that? So I think there's all sorts of really interesting questions around there. And then the second direction that I'm really interested in is kind of further investigating the ethical risks of LLM's use of language. Specifically, like I said, there's all sorts of interesting things related to the fact that now our interaction modality is in language with these AI systems. So I want to keep further studying these AI dilemmas and towards developing policy. So we just submitted a paper to FACT last week, looking at the human factors that affect the acceptability of use cases, as well as not just their literacy, but also how they reason through different sort of acceptability levels. And then the ultimate goal of this kind of direction is to build democratic frameworks to improve consensus on AI dilemmas. So figuring out okay, how can we actually decide whether something should be legislated or not? Another direction which we also I have some works under submission is understanding what it means for LLMs to speak language. So one of the works that we looked at is building a framework for studying user reliance on LLMs based on what kinds of language cues it uses, specifically looking at how anthropomorphism in the expressions of sort of politeness that an agent uses. So things like, oh, I'm happy to help, versus thank you for your question, versus just not saying anything, and how that increases or changes how humans rely on AI agents in these kind of real world interactions. And then something that we also just submitted to FACT was related to what it means for LLMs to potentially personalize and adapt to minority users and potentially start talking in minority related sociolects. So these are dialects that are related to the lived experience of minority groups, and could be seen as culturally appropriating if an LLM kind of goes into that space. How does that affect kind of how people react to LLMs as well as rely on them? With that, I want to thank you all for listening to my talk and for being here. And yeah, this is my research group that I'm really proud of that did all of this work and all of the other work going on in my lab. And I'm ready to take some questions if you have any.